Hi, Misha here, and recently revisited the North American Aviation B-25 Mitchell, looking at Corgi models. So let's keep on looking at American bombers, or bombers in general, and look at some offerings from Douglas, which, to be fair, honestly relate to the B-25. Over on the left side, we have two variants, a glazed or glass-nosed bombing variant, and a solid all-purpose nose, as they called it, attack variant of the A-20 Havoc. And over here we have the same, a solid nose with guns and a glass nose with bombardier of Douglas's more advanced A26 Intruder. Later, I think I said Intruder, I apologize, I'm tired. Invader. Later to be redesignated the B26, and then A26 again, because confusion. And not to be confused with the B26 Marauder. Whole other aircraft. Yeah, these were all kind of riding that line between either very heavy fighter, attack plane, or light bomber. So with that, let's just do a little bit of historical overview. I don't want to go too deep into them, but enough for context. Let's start off with the gun nose, or all-purpose nose version, as Douglas called it. I guess it would be all-purpose if your purpose is to shoot the shit out of everything. The design really dates back to a concept, an idea, in 1937 from Donald Douglas himself, Ed Heinemann, and of Hot Rod fame, and Jack Northrop of being Jack Northrop fame. They had this idea that they could have a twin-engine light bomber. They could get up to about 250 miles per hour and carry a payload of about 1,000 pounds. But once they really sketched it out, they realized that it really just wasn't future-proof. It might have seemed alright by 1937, but much like a lot of British designs from the same period, it would have been quickly out of date. Nevertheless, at the end of 1937 and into 1938, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued specifications for a new aircraft. Call it a light bomber or attack aircraft. And interestingly, this wasn't really for the U.S. military. This was for export customers. Really, at the beginning, it was France that was mostly interested, and then Britain also got involved. And in 1939, they kind of made their positions official. The prototype, known as the D7B, or D7A, would first fly in January of 1939, and it would go up against competition from North American's NA-40, as well as a design from Martin and Stearman, and would be declared the winner of the contract. France would place an initial relatively slow order, but after war began, they quickly increased their order to over 270 aircraft, and deliveries actually were underway when France was invaded. About 64 were in country during the invasion in 1940, and of course many were captured by the Vichy government. So what was Douglas to do with the remaining order? Well, they would end up giving them to the British, who would give it two names. Havoc, when it was operated at night, primarily as a night fighter, and Boston, when it was operated during the day as a bomber. Now, originally, it wasn't really set up to be a bomber. That's not what the French wanted or needed. They wanted a short-range attack aircraft, hence why the gun nose was kind of a early idea, and the bomb load, while it had it, was somewhat lacking. More importantly, the range, the fuel was lacking. But they would address this. They would increase many aspects of the aircraft, giving it more range, more armor, and it evolved very quickly in 1941 to a very respectable bird. So much so that the U.S. Army Air Corps, who originally had next to no interest in it, decided, maybe we should get some. So prior to World War II, they had about 140 in inventory, but of course this number would quickly rise. So what is this plane? Well, she's about 48 feet long, 61 feet wide, 2-engine. Originally she had a crew of 4. Later versions would reduce this to 3. She was actually very fast and maneuverable for her day and time. Her maximum speed was between about 315 and 325 miles per hour, depending on the altitude. And she could reach over 23,000 feet. And after some versions and whatnot, she could carry a payload of about 2,000 bombs in the internal bay, plus up to 2,000 pounds in additional, well, whatever, fuel, guns, or sometimes ordnance shackled to the outside. Originally, her guns would be pretty fixed. They would try 20mm cannon in earlier versions, but they ended up going to an all 50 cal Browning nose with 6 50 cals in it. The rate of fire was consistent, the accuracy was good. The 20mm cannons just couldn't be put on the target in time. They would also go to a new turret within production. Here, it was powered. There was originally one ventral gun and a flexible mount, 30 caliber. This was upgraded to a 50 cal. And that's where we get this version here. The A-20G entered into production in early 1943 and would be the most mass-produced. Douglas, along with Boeing, would produce nearly 7,500 of these. Many would go to the RAF. The Free French would fly some. But about 1/3 of all production, over 3,400, would go to Soviet Russia. In fact, this was the most common foreign airplane in Russian Air Force service, and the Russian Navy did fly a few of these. These started inter-squadron use in Britain in late 1941 and started to be deployed on combat missions in 1942 and kind of appeared in many theaters throughout that year. Britain would use the Boston bomber variant to attack installations in Germany. They would also use them, because they were pretty accurate, to attack the battleship Scharnhorst and Prince Eugen during Operation Cerberus. And they would later attack other kinds of targets throughout Northern Europe. They would also be flown by the British and Americans in Northern Africa and subsequent campaigns. And the Russians would begin flying them in June of 1942, using them as low-level attack aircraft against the Germans. And finally, towards the end of the summer, they started to be used in the Pacific, where their ability to come in low and deliver pinpoint targeting was very useful in taking out airplanes on the ground, fuel depots, ammunition caches, even trucks and railways. As I said in the B-25 video, medium to high level bombing wasn't really that effective in the Pacific because of the environment. So you needed to get low to really hit your target. The problem was the range. originally this had very poor range. Even later versions like the Boston 3, the range was only adequate. And again, the bomb load realistically was about 2,000 to 3,000 pounds tops, and that was kind of loading them out. And especially if you wanted to go anywhere, if you loaded up 4,000 pounds, you would make it about 2 feet. But yeah, most people on the crew would do double duty. Not surprising. Well, let's put the G back on its stand. Like I said, this is more of an attack aircraft, really skirting that line. It was the most produced version. But now let's look at the light bomber variant. This is a miniature bomber, with the major difference being the glass nose. Essentially, the co-pilot navigator would crawl down through a little hatch into the nose if and when needed. Still have the turret. In the front, we still have two 50 cal machine guns. And this can carry additional fuel if needed. The Havoc's usefulness in the Pacific was limited because of its range, but it still saw heavy use. But it would be replaced in a lot of theaters, but not everyone. They would continue to fly it in some areas throughout the remainder of the war. The version here, the A-20J, known as the Boston Mark IV, and the A-20K, the Boston Mark V, are the same aircraft, just with different engines in them, but basically the same performance. And these were meant to lead bomb groups. They would appear around 1944. They'd be used after D-Day as a kind of an interesting version of close air support, softening up German targets and then mopping up leftover pockets. And would continue flying until the end of the war in 1945. But production would end in 1944 because they would moving on to their new A-26. But with nearly 7,500 built, these would stay in service for some time. The U.S. Air Force would officially retire the Havoc in 1949, although it had been considered obsolete for a couple years before that. It was a good aircraft, and it's good that, and I guess that's why Ed Hindman and Jack Northrop and Donald Douglas were good aircraft designers. If they had gone with the original design, you would have had something more like the Bristol. I don't know. It's good that they skipped ahead because most designs from 1937, 1938 were woefully obsolete by 1945. And while the Havoc wasn't exactly at the bleeding edge of technology, it was still very adequate. But work on its successor was well underway while it was still in construction. I guess I'm doing this one on the stand because the propellers are too tall to sit. Alright, the A26 Invader. Well, the A-20 leaned more into the attack role, which makes sense because that's kind of what the French, who had a good say-so in its design, were going after. But with this, they were going more for the bomber, although it was still very much an attack aircraft. Also, they were hoping photo reconnaissance. They had been using the A-20 for that in some instances in Europe too. The A-20 was maneuverable and relatively quick, but not perfect. Its characteristics were decent in the Pacific, but in Europe, they discovered that the precision low-level bombing that they like to do in the Pacific did not work. German flak chewed them up, so they had to start going to medium altitude bombing raids using the Norden bomb sight. And so for this, more speed and a larger payload and more range would all be welcome. Well, luckily, Ed Heinemann, along with a very talented team, had been hard at work designing the replacement, and the prototype first flew in July of 1942. It was promising, but it had a few issues, including engines that were running a little hot and a nose landing gear that was a little on the brittle as hell side. So they had to tweak it a bit. And so it would not be until just shy of a year later when it was ready for production. And to that end, the Army Air Corps, soon to be Army Air Forces, took delivery in late 1943 and began transitioning crews over to fly the new aircraft. So in early 44 they were training, and then they started to deploy these first in the Pacific early that summer, and then the first ones would make it to Europe late summer, early autumn of 1944. So what do we have here? Well, she's a little bit bigger all around, 50 feet by 70 feet. She has a crew of 3 still. She was considerably faster than the A-20, top speed of just a hair under 360 miles per hour. In fact, she was the fastest American bomber in World War II. She also had a higher maximum altitude of about 28,500 feet. She had a longer range, not quite double, but close to double that of her predecessor. And she could carry more ordnance, more payload. She could carry 4,000 pounds in the bay, and 2,000 additional pounds under the wings, or what have you, including rockets. By 1944, aerial rockets are starting to come into use. The A26B is the solid nose version here. Originally it had 6 50 cal Brownings. Later versions might have 8. The A26C is the glass nose, the bombing version. The A26A was to be a dedicated night fighting version, but it was scrapped because of the Northrop P-61. They did try making the A-20 in America into a night fighter, similar to how the British had done early in the war. This was the P-70. It did not do well. Standard defense, you had a top turret with 2 50 cal guns and a bottom turret with 2 50 cal guns, but these were not directly manned. Rather, they were powered, and they were controlled by the radio operator, who sat behind the crew and used mirrors, periscopes, what have you, to direct his turret. Now this one here is from the Pacific, and the bottom turret is removed, and this was pretty often done because the bottom turret was not very useful, and if they removed it, they could install an additional fuel tank, additional fuel cell. Much like with the B-25 Mitchell, they also enjoyed putting guns everywhere on these, in little gun packs on the side of the fuselage, hanging them under the wings, mounting them in the wings. I don't know. Some of them had well over 20 guns, 50 cal guns on board. No 75mm cannon, though. But that said, they still retained that bombing capability because they were able to fly higher and faster. They were better suited as a true light bomber. So with that, what about their service? Well, to put it bluntly, many in the Pacific, pilots and generals, did not like them. They weren't quite as maneuverable and easy to handle, even if they were faster than the A-20. And they didn't have quite the pinpoint low-level strafing ability. And I think sometimes just tradition, you know. So really they didn't operate too much in the Pacific, although they did. Don't believe for a minute they didn't. But really where they found their calling was in Europe. Their first test run in September of 1944 went off perfectly. No planes were lost and they hit their objectives. So they were used throughout the fall and winter. And they were used to mop up pockets of resistance and help secure Italy in 1945. And just generally show the flag. They were also instrumental in night operations and reconnaissance, photo missions, and what have you. And they were really well liked. I believe they flew over 11,000 missions. Not bad for a plane that was only in theater a little over half a year. So, you know, the A-20 maybe was better in the Pacific. The A-26 was maybe better in Europe. Since production was relatively late in the war, and since the first year of production was relatively slow, they would only build just over 2,500 of these. But when you combine it with the earlier A-20, that means Douglas produced just shy of 10,000 attack aircraft light bombers for the war effort, with assistance from Boeing too. Well, what about the C variant and after the war? Now, the nose on the Invader was modular, so you could convert between a B and a C in the field with a kit in very short time, so you weren't just locked into one or the other. The C would have a couple of 50 cals up front and could have turrets, although this one does not have turrets. They've been removed for extra fuel and to install additional 50 cal guns in the wings. A very successful bomber in World War II, and even though only 2,500 were built, it had a very long post-World War II career. In 1947, the U.S. Air Force was established, separate from the U.S. Army Air Forces, and in 1948 they restructured. Namely, they got rid of the A designation. The B-26 would be this plane's new name, and the old Martin Marauder would be designated RB-26 briefly before being officially completely retired in 1950. So the Marauder was out of service before Korea, meaning this was the B-26. And it served a lot in Korea. In fact, it was used in the earliest bombing missions over North Korea and enjoyed pretty good success for the first year, 1950. But by 1951, as more and more MiGs were in the skies, these started to be sitting ducks. 360 miles per hour, give or take, not so fast in the jet age. So they switched these to night missions, either night bombing or just reconnaissance. Heck, some of them were even used to monitor the weather. And they would continue to fly missions throughout the entire war. And in fact, B-26s were used during the last bombing missions in June of 1953. These were typically operated by the Tactical Air Command. And they were credited with destroying a huge amount of hardware. Over 38,000 vehicles, like 400 trains, even half a dozen aircraft on the ground. Of course, they had their own losses, and their airframes were starting to wear. So in 1957, most of them were taken out of service, but not all. In 1960, some were stationed in Thailand, and they flew over Vietnam in fake Vietnamese markings. And they were kind of named RB-26s to kind of disguise what they were doing. But by 1964, they were having problems with stress fractures. In fact, some wings gave way on a couple of planes early that year, so the whole fleet was grounded. The truth is that after 20 years of service, they were wearing out. So basically, the Invader fleet was grounded. It's also worth pointing out that the CIA got their hands on some of these. They operated quite a few in Southeast Asia, but they also operated some or gave some to the very failed Bay of Pigs fiasco. However, the old Douglas wasn't quite done yet. They would take 40 lower hour airframes and essentially rebuild them. Virtually new wings, new engines, new fuel tanks. And they would turn these into the B-26K counterinsurgent. And these would be used to attack targets on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other things, and continue night operations, something the Invader had been good at since World War II. And kind of funnily enough, again, in 1966, the name would revert to A26A because the B for bomber had negative political connotations for American allies in Southeast Asia. So they would finally kind of end their career lying under their same name. The last Vietnam missions were in 1969, by which time it was decided that even the rebuilt K models had just hit the end of their usable service life. The airframes were just tuckered out, 25 years old, and had been used in 3 major wars, not to mention training and all that. They were done. A few more would hang on in the National Guard until the early 70s, but even they would be retired by 1972. But not bad. It made it 30 years in Air Force service, and multiple name changes. A very competent aircraft. And a neat one to boot. So it only seemed honest to give this aircraft line its due again. All 4 models are 1/72 scale diecast from Hobbymaster. Kind of interesting. They don't do a lot of bombers, but again, these are right on that line where they could be considered more of a heavy fighter attack aircraft. Yeah, what have you. They come with gear up or down, bomb bays open or closed, rotating turrets, and you can remove the crew figures. But in my experience, that just usually men's mind fall over and look like they're sleeping on the job. Sometimes the corgi method of kind of sticking them in place is not a bad thing. They're pretty heavy metal. The wings and bodies are all metal. Some of the tails plastic. I would say that really the biggest and really major and only ding against the Hobbymaster are their stands. Air Force One and Corgi do a really good job with their stands. Hobbymaster's cradles are fine. Where they really fall down is they use a small base plate, and it's plastic, so it's light. Corgi and Air Force One often use metal base plates when necessary. Hobbymaster will use a metal stem sometimes. Sometimes they won't. Just depends. So yeah, they're not the most stable. That's probably my biggest ding. Some of them, they do have holes, like for the Havoc, but if you want them on the gear, you can plug them with little squares. Others, like the Invaders, they just sit in there. And of course they do several versions of each. I just kind of wanted a solid and a glass nose of each type just to represent them, because they were major parts of World War II history, both for America, Soviet Russia, and the UK. So what do you think? Do you like the B-25 more? Do you like these more? What's your favorite World War II bomber? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you could, check out some of my other videos, maybe. Hopefully the new cameras continue to work out alright. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.